He bought the 9 billion-year old virgin bride for $3. But she screamed when the cowboy Neil Elias Carter had spent years alone on his ranch. After the loss of his family in an Apache raid he'd kept to himself, working hard to keep his cattle and his land. His heart, heavy with guilt, had no room for friendships or laughter. There was nothing but the endless sky and the vast land stretching before him. The emptiness in his life was a reminder of the past, one that he could never escape. It was a cold morning when he decided to ride out and check on his cattle. The wind was biting and the clouds hung low in the sky, as if the world itself mourned with him. As he made his way through the rough terrain, he spotted something strange in the distance. It was an old oak tree, twisted and crooked, standing tall in the middle of a dry creek bed. At first, Elias thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Hanging from the tree, a girl dangled, lifeless. Her hands were bound and her feet barely touched the ground. The rope was tight around her neck and her head hung low like a broken doll. Elias froze for a moment, his pulse quickening. His first instinct was to turn away, to leave the girl and ride back to the safety of his ranch. After all, he had nothing to do with the Apache, and he had no desire to get involved in whatever trouble had led to this moment. But something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the pull of conscience, a reminder of what it meant to be human. The girl was young, perhaps no older than 16 or 17. She had long dark hair, now tangled with dust and blood. Her face, though pale and bruised, was beautiful in an innocent way. Elias looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the land was quiet. There was no one to claim her life, no one to explain what had happened. He didn't know why, but he couldn't leave her there. Not like this. He spurred his horse forward and quickly dismounted. With trembling hands, he grabbed his knife and cut through the rope. The girl collapsed into his arms, and Elias caught her, his heart racing. She was still alive, though barely. His mind was a blur of thoughts. What should he do? Should he leave her here? Would anyone be after him if he helped her? But no, he couldn't leave her to die, not when he had the power to save her. He laid her gently across his saddle and mounted his horse, urging it into a swift gallop back to his ranch. The cold wind stung his face as he rode, but Elias barely noticed. His focus was solely on the girl, who was slowly regaining consciousness. Her breathing was shallow and her body trembled with the effort to stay alive. As he rode, Elias couldn't help but wonder who she was. What had happened to her? Why had she been left to die in such a cruel way? His mind churned with questions, but he had no answers. He only knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let her die. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was beginning to set. Elias dismounted and carefully lifted the girl off the horse. Her head lolled to the side, and her eyes fluttered open for a moment before closing again. She was too weak to fight him off, too weak to do anything. Inside his small cabin, Elias laid her on his bed and quickly went to work. He started a fire, heated water, and cleaned the wounds on her face and arms. There were bruises everywhere, some fresh, some old. But it was her neck that worried him the most. The rope had left a deep mark, and Elias feared she might have trouble breathing. He did what he could, gently massaging her neck and applying a cloth soaked in warm water to soothe her. Hours passed, and Elias watched over her in silence. He was not a man of many words, and he didn't know what to say to the girl. She didn't speak either. Her body was still and weak, but her breathing had become steadier. Elias was relieved, but his mind was restless. Why had this girl been punished? Why had she been left to die in such a terrible way? He didn't know if she was an Apache or a settler's daughter, but it didn't matter to him now. She was here, in his cabin, and he had a responsibility to keep her safe. As the night deepened, Elias settled into his chair by the fire, keeping a watchful eye on her. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room. The girl's eyes flickered open again, and she stared at him for a moment before closing them once more. "You're safe now," Elias murmured softly, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. The words felt hollow, as if they held no real meaning. Could a person like him, someone who had failed his family, someone who had lived with so much guilt, truly save another? He didn't know, but he wasn't about to give up on her. The night stretched on, and Elias stayed awake, unable to sleep. His thoughts kept him awake, questioning everything he had done. Should he have helped her? What would the settlers say if they found out? But then he thought of his wife and son, the two people who had died because of his own mistakes. He had failed to protect them, and he had to live with that every day. This girl, though a stranger, reminded him of the love and care he once had for his family. Perhaps, in saving her, he could begin to heal the wounds in his own soul. In the quiet of the night, Elias made a promise to himself. He would protect her. He would give her a chance at life, no matter the cost. And maybe, just maybe, in helping her, he could find a way to forgive himself. Elias Carter had lived alone for many years. His ranch sat on the edge of a vast, dry plain where the wind howled like a restless animal. He worked from dawn till dusk, taking care of his cattle and tending to the land that had once been full of life and laughter. But all that had changed when he lost his family in an Apache raid. His wife Clara and their young son Thomas had been taken from him, leaving Elias with nothing but memories and guilt. He never left his ranch, and his only companions were the cattle and the silence that surrounded him. He had no need for friends or company. The pain of losing his family had hollowed him out, and he had become a man without hope or joy. One cold morning, as Elias rode out to check on his cattle, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The wind was sharp, and the earth seemed to groan under the weight of the cold. Elias kept his head down, lost in his thoughts as he urged his horse forward. His mind was heavy with memories of his wife's laughter and his son's voice calling to him from the yard. As he crested a small hill, Elias spotted something strange in the distance. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he drew closer, his heart began to pound. There, beneath a gnarled tree, stood a sight that stopped him in his tracks. A young girl hung from the branch, her body limp and lifeless. Her hands were tied and her feet barely touched the ground. Elias's first instinct was to turn around and leave. This wasn't his problem. He didn't need to get involved with the Apache or the settlers' conflicts. But something in the way the girl hung there, abandoned and forgotten, stirred something in him. He couldn't just leave her to die. He spurred his horse forward, his heart racing as he approached the hanging girl. She was young, no older than 16, with long dark hair that had once been neatly tied but now hung in tangled strands around her face. She wore a simple dress, torn and dirtied by the elements. Her face was bruised, and her lips were pale. Elias dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the dry grass beneath him. He pulled out his knife and cut through the rope, catching the girl's body before it hit the ground. Her weight was light in his arms, but her head lolled to the side as if she were already gone. His breath came in quick, sharp bursts as he held her close, checking for any sign of life. There was no pulse, no movement. For a moment, Elias thought he had arrived too late. But then, just as he was about to give up, the girl's chest rose and fell with a shallow breath. She was alive. Barely. Elias lifted her gently and placed her on his horse, tying her securely to the saddle. He knew he had to get her to safety, away from whatever had led to her hanging. He didn't know who had done this to her, but he knew it had to be stopped. The ride back to the ranch felt like an eternity. The wind bit at Elias's face, but he didn't notice. His mind was consumed with the girl, her fragile form swaying with every step of the horse. He had saved her life, but what would he do with her now? What had she done to deserve such a cruel fate? By the time Elias reached his cabin, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon. The world was painted in shades of orange and purple, but Elias barely noticed. He dismounted and carefully lifted the girl off the horse, carrying her inside. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, just the way Elias liked it. He didn't need anything else. There was a fire in the hearth, but it was low, barely more than a few glowing embers. He set the girl down on his bed, her body limp and cold. She looked so small, so fragile, and Elias's heart tightened in his chest. He moved quickly, gathering the supplies he needed: water, a cloth, bandages. Her clothes were torn, her skin bruised, but it was her neck that concerned him the most. The rope had left a deep mark, and Elias wasn't sure if she would be able to breathe properly again. He carefully cleaned the wounds on her arms and face, trying not to hurt her, though she was barely conscious. As he worked, Elias's mind raced. Who was she? What had happened to her? Was she a settler or Apache? He didn't know, but it didn't matter. She was a human being, and she didn't deserve to be left to die like that. When Elias finished tending to her wounds, he sat down beside the bed, watching over her as the night grew darker. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin there was only the crackling of the fire and the quiet rhythm of her breathing. Elias didn't know what to do next. He couldn't just leave her here. That much was clear. But he also couldn't afford to bring trouble to his doorstep. He had seen what happened when the settlers and the Apache clashed. The bloodshed, the hatred, it never ended. For a long time, Elias sat in the silence, watching the girl's chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. He couldn't help but feel responsible for her. After all, if he hadn't stopped to help her, she would be dead now, and the world would have forgotten her. The girl's eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment her gaze locked with Elias's. There was confusion in her eyes, but no fear, just a quiet understanding. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her words so faint that Elias almost didn't hear them. He nodded, unsure of what to say. "You're safe now," he finally murmured, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two strangers in a world that had forgotten them both. Elias knew that his life was about to change. But whether that change would bring peace or more pain, he could not yet tell. Days passed and the ranch was quiet again, but there was no peace in Elias's mind. The girl, Naya, had begun to recover. Her breathing was steady, and the marks on her neck were fading, though the memory of what had happened to her remained. Elias had expected her to be weak, but Naya was strong in her silence. She had not spoken much, only nodding when he asked if she needed anything. She ate little, drank just enough, and stayed mostly in bed, staring at the ceiling, as if lost in her thoughts. Elias knew that the quiet could not last. Soon, someone would come looking for Naya. He did not know who, whether it would be the settlers or the Apache, but he had to prepare. He couldn't hide her forever. The land around his ranch was wide, but not enough to keep people from finding her. On the fourth day after saving her life, Naya finally spoke again. Elias had been out checking the fences when he returned to the cabin. He found Naya sitting at the window looking out at the endless plains. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light across the land, but it seemed to do little to brighten Naya's expression. She turned as he entered, her dark eyes looking at him with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. "You saved my life," she said quietly, her voice steady but low. Elias nodded, setting down his hat and gloves. "I couldn't leave you to die." For a moment there was only silence between them. The weight of their shared history hung heavy in the room. Naya's gaze drifted back to the window, and Elias took a step closer, but he did not sit beside her. He respected the distance she kept, though it was not the same distance he kept from his own heart. "I don't know what you think of me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not the monster they say I am." "What do you mean?" "They say I killed a settler's son. That's why they hung me. But it's not true." Naya's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. "My village, it was raided. We were only defending ourselves. But they found my name on the list, and the settlers blamed me." Elias stayed quiet, his mind spinning with questions. He had heard the stories of the Apache raids, their brutal attacks, the way they took and killed without mercy. But he had never asked questions. He had always assumed the worst of them. Now, hearing Naya's words, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "I did," she said, "but they found me. They always find us." Elias nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He had lost everything in one terrible night. The night the Apache had raided his family's ranch. His wife Clara and young son Thomas had been taken from him. He had never learned the truth about who had done it, but he had always believed it was the Apache. Now, standing before him was a girl who claimed she was the victim, not the villain. There was a part of him that wanted to believe her. Another part of him, the part that still grieved for his family, wanted to distrust her. He didn't know if it was his guilt or his anger that made it so hard to hear her words. "I don't want trouble," Elias said finally. "I saved you because I couldn't let you die. But I can't protect you from the world outside." Naya met his gaze, her eyes filled with something Elias couldn't describe. It was a mix of sadness and resolve. "I understand," she said softly, "but I can't just disappear. I have to face what happened. I have to clear my name." Elias felt a sharp pang in his chest. He knew what it was like to carry the weight of a past that wasn't fully understood. He had never had the chance to clear his name, to explain what had truly happened to his family. It was something he had lived with for years, unable to let go. "There's nothing I can do for you," he said, his voice tight. "I'm not a judge, and I'm not a warrior. I just want to be left alone." "I know," Naya whispered. "I don't want to cause you more pain, but you saved me, Elias. And I need your help." Elias looked away, his throat tight. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the very walls could sense the pressure building between them. Suddenly, there was a sound outside, the distant sound of hooves on dirt. Elias's heart skipped a beat. His eyes snapped to the door, then back to Naya, who stood up quickly, her face pale. "Hide," he whispered urgently. Naya didn't move at first, her eyes wide with fear. But when the sound grew closer, she nodded and ran toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the shadows. Elias grabbed his rifle from the wall and moved quietly to the window. He peered out, squinting against the fading light. A group of riders was approaching, moving fast. Elias didn't recognize them, but he could tell by their uniforms and the way they held themselves that they were settlers, most likely looking for Naya. He didn't have time to think. He quickly loaded his rifle and positioned himself behind the door, waiting for the riders to reach the cabin. When they did, he stepped out, rifle aimed, and called out, "What do you want?" The riders halted in surprise. One man, older and wearing a dusty hat, looked Elias up and down. "We're looking for an Apache girl," he said, his voice rough and harsh. "She's been causing trouble. We know she's here." Elias felt his pulse quicken, but he stood firm. "There's no Apache girl here," he said coldly. "Now, turn around and leave before I make you." The older man frowned, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying, Carter. We know you've been hiding them." Elias didn't flinch. He knew this could turn ugly, but he wasn't going to let them take Naya. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my land," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. For a moment, the tension was thick in the air. The rider seemed to weigh his options, then finally gave a sharp nod. "We'll be back," he said gruffly. As the riders turned and left, Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the danger wasn't over. Naya was still at risk, and Elias knew that hiding her was not the answer. He turned back to the cabin and found Naya standing by the window, her face pale but determined. She hadn't said a word, but Elias knew she understood. The time for hiding was over. The days following the settlers' visit were quiet, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was coming. The settlers had made their threat clear. They would return for Naya, and they would not leave without her. Every time he walked outside, his eyes darted across the land, watching for any sign of movement. But so far, there had been no more visitors. Still, the tension in the air was thick, like a storm that was ready to break. Naya, too, felt the weight of what was to come. She had grown stronger in the days since Elias had saved her, but the fear that had once been so consuming still lingered. It was always there, in the back of her mind. The fear of what might happen when the settlers came back. The fear of being dragged away, punished for a crime she hadn't committed. But despite the fear, Naya had made up her mind. She couldn't hide forever. Elias had tried to convince her to leave, to disappear into the vast wilderness and never return, but Naya had refused. She had to face what happened, she told him. She had to clear her name, no matter the cost. Elias knew she was right, but the thought of losing her made him uneasy. She had become more than just the girl he had saved. She had become someone he cared about. It was late afternoon when the sound of hooves reached Elias's ears. He was outside mending a fence when he heard the unmistakable rhythm of riders approaching. His heart skipped a beat. The settlers were back. He dropped his tools and rushed toward the cabin, his hand instinctively going to the rifle he kept by the door. Naya was already there, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak, but Elias could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in his own reflection all those years ago when he had lost everything. "They're here," Elias said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Stay inside. Don't come out unless I call for you." Naya nodded and stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the cabin. Elias didn't wait. He grabbed his rifle, loading it quickly, and walked out to face the approaching riders. This time there were more of them. 4 riders, all armed and with an air of authority about them. The leader, the older man who had spoken before, rode at the front. His eyes locked on Elias as they approached, and for a moment the 2 men stood in silence, neither willing to back down. "You're hiding her, Carter," the older man said, his voice gruff. "We know she's here, and we're not leaving without her." Elias stood firm, his rifle held loosely at his side. "You're not taking her," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of anger and regret. "Not without a fight," the older man sneered. "You're not in a position to make demands. We'll do whatever it takes to bring her to justice." Elias's hand tightened around the rifle. "You don't know what justice is," he said, his voice cold. "You don't know what happened." "We know enough," the man shot back. "That Apache girl murdered my son, and I won't let her go until she's paid for it." Elias felt his heart pound in his chest. He had heard the story 100 times. The story of the settler's son who had been killed during a raid. But now, standing before this man, Elias knew that there was more to the story. There always was. He had seen the same thing in his own life. The stories that were told, the truths that were hidden. "She didn't kill your son," Elias said, his voice firm. "It wasn't her fault. The man laughed bitterly. You're defending her now? After all the pain she's caused? Elias took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the man's face. I'm not defending her, I'm defending the truth. The other riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, exchanging glances. The older man's face reddened, but he didn't move. You're making a mistake, Carter, the man growled, and you're going to regret it. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind howled around them, carrying the weight of their words into the dry land. Elias knew this wasn't going to end without bloodshed, but he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. He had spent years hiding from the past, running from the mistakes he had made. But now, standing here, he realized that he couldn't run anymore. I don't want trouble, Elias said, his voice low and steady. I just want to live in peace. The older man's eyes narrowed. Then stay out of our way. The tension in the air was palpable, but Elias held his ground. He wasn't going to let them take Naya. Not without a fight. Suddenly, from behind him, there was a movement. Naya appeared, her eyes wide but determined. She stepped out from the shadows, her hands raised in peace. Stop, she called, her voice strong despite the fear in her eyes. It's me you want. I'm the one you're looking for. Elias turned to her, his heart sinking. Naya, no. But it was too late. She had already stepped forward, standing between Elias and the settlers. I didn't kill your son, Naya said, her voice steady now. I didn't kill anyone. The older man's face twisted with anger. Then why did you run? He shouted. I didn't run, Naya replied, her voice rising with a mixture of defiance and sorrow. I fought to survive, and when I came back, they blamed me for everything. The man's face softened for a moment, but the anger never left his eyes. You should have stayed away, he said. I couldn't, Naya said quietly. I have to face the truth. I have to clear my name. Elias watched in silence as Naya faced the settlers, her body tense but her voice unwavering. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in years he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would set them free. The older man looked at Elias, then back at Naya. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he spoke. Then prove it, he said gruffly. Prove you didn't do it. Naya nodded. I will. The man turned his horse around and gestured for the others to follow. We'll be watching, he said, his voice cold. You'd better not make us regret this. As the riders left, Elias watched them go. He felt a sense of relief but also a lingering tension in his chest. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while he felt like he had a chance. Naya turned to him, her eyes meeting his with quiet gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Elias nodded. We'll find a way to make things right, he said, his voice soft but full of resolve. Together.